It was a sort of a cliche story in a class in university, but it was not, I think the decision is not that you're going to write so much, it's that there's a sort of an awakening and you realize that you're a writer or you realize you're an artist. So it didn't feel like something I would try. It didn't feel like I was going to try out for the football team. Didn't feel like I was going to decide to be a doctor or something. It felt absolutely like I discovered something that was in me. And I think most artists work this way. You know, I think I mean, the closest analogy I can draw is it's almost like hitting puberty or something. There's something you become aware of that's always been inside you, and you realize, this is a part of me, this has always been in me. And the choice is how hard you're going to work at it, how brave you're going to be. But the choice is not really, you know, whether you like it or not, because it's a compulsion. I mean, it's an animal drive to write or make art or whatever it is. And in my case, it was quite strictly for writing fiction. I don't know why. And you know, later in life, so that was 21 when that happened. Yeah, I was a sort of a juvenile delinquent. I dropped out of high school, and when I was 21, this is my first year in university. Later, I met other sort of struggling writers, say 10 years later, and many of them cared quite a lot about, okay, how do you dress when you're a writer? What does it mean to be a writer? What's your role? How are you supposed to act? What are you supposed to read? And you know, I'd never cared about any of that stuff. All I knew is that I had to write. You know, so the only decision was how brave I was going to be. You know, how much you let your insecurities and fears govern your behavior. That's really the only decision there is. Yeah. My brother is a classical music composer, so there's clearly something artistic in the family. I mean, art is definitely in the genes. For me, it was always writing, and it was always fiction, and it was always novels. And I've written a few short stories in between, but it was always, the first things I cared about were novels. Yeah, I wrote a very bad, very long novel in university. I showed to all my friends. They all couldn't read it. I mean, they couldn't even get to page 10 or 15. It was 600 pages. Then I wrote another one after university, a second failed novel. That, you know, the first book was terrible, and the second book was only mediocre. It was, in other words, it was a big improvement. And I think, yeah, I don't know why. I mean, it's just the long fiction is all I cared to do. I mean, I love music, and I love looking at visual art, and I love movies, but I never cared about, you know, doing those things. So in university, yeah, in the U.S., it's quite expensive, so you borrow money. So they in fact, in the U.S., they make sure you can go because there's always money available for you to borrow, right? So I borrowed money like most middle-class people in the U.S. After the U.S., I took a job in finance, a very high-paying job, because I thought, okay, I will work this job on Wall Street. I will, you know, I'll sort of make enough money to retire young and write that way. So I thought eventually I'll retire and eventually I'll become a full-time writer, because it had not occurred to me somehow that it was possible to live from writing alone. And I would say after about 3 years at the bank, this investment bank, UBS, maybe 2.5 years, I realized, okay, all that makes me happy is writing. I was beginning to call in sick so I could stay home and write. Sort of cascade of events which led to the sort of conscious realization of this is the only thing that makes me happy. So I knew that it was a drive and I knew I had to do it, but I had not realized that my happiness, my sort of psychological state was dependent on whether I wrote or not. In my late 20s, that's when I realized that was the case. So I quit the bank, had some money saved up. I wrote for about a year with no other job because I'd saved enough money to do that, and then I ran out of money. And then things became quite hard because the second book, which I thought was going to be a work of literary genius and a masterpiece, and I thought the second book I was positive was going to make me famous, well not famous, but famous as literary writers go, and in fact it was very mediocre. And I put everything I knew into it. I worked as hard as I could have worked. I worked for 3 years, and it still was was not quite good enough, which was lucky. It was quite lucky in hindsight. So I then moved back in with my parents because I realized the key to writing or making any kind of art is time. And if I knew if I lived in my parents' basement, I would not have to work as much. Instead of working full time, I could work 3/4 time. And instead of working 5 days a week, I could work 4. So I drove an ambulance. I worked a construction job, remodeling houses, just doing also, from hanging sheetrock to running electric to framing a bit, and doing plumbing and stuff like that. And after about 2 years, I got into a graduate program. So in the U.S., again, we have these sort of highly funded writing programs post-university. And I applied to a bunch of them once, was turned down by all of them. My writing, there's sort of a time of awakening, I guess, sort of a time of having many epiphanies about how I wrote, how I made art. And that, I wrote a few short stories which got me into these graduate programs and then got published. And that was, so now I was about 31, so about 10 years of taking myself seriously as a writer, devoting all my energy to writing, when I was not working to pay my rent or to eat. And then it was about year 10 that things turned around quite radically. And I sort of found my voice. I found one, at that time, narrow way of telling a story, but that was true. One just sort of narrow way of making art, and I could tell one type of story with one type of narrator. That was good. It was good. So those things were published. They got me into this graduate program where for 3 years they paid us to write. They gave us a small amount of money. We did not have to teach. So for 3 years, I took a few easy literature classes, and I wrote. And that's where I wrote the first published novel, which was called American Rust. There's one goal, right? There's only one thing that actually matters, and that is that you keep writing. That's all that matters. So whatever it takes to keep writing. You lie to yourself in small ways. You lie to yourself in big ways. You tell yourself, well, if it doesn't work in 1 year, I'll quit. Or you tell yourself, if it doesn't work in 6 months, I'll quit. And then that time comes and you just, here it is, and you make another promise to yourself, and it's fine. I think for whatever reason, I always had, I think as artists go, I have this sort of a large amount of faith in myself or in my own abilities, and I'm not sure why that is. I don't think it's connected to art, it's just maybe how I was raised, which in hindsight has been quite lucky, because what kills most writers is their, no one cares enough. When you're a young artist, no one cares enough to stop you. No one cares, I think Leonard Cohen, the American musician, or Canadian musician, said something along the lines of, the only thing that really matters for a young poet, meaning a young artist of any type, is that you have to have an absolutely durable ego. Your ego has to be bulletproof. Even though, of course, what you're making early on is quite bad. It's quite mediocre, usually. So you're just writing, or you're making music, or you're making art just to hear the sound of your own voice. You're actually like a child learning to speak. And it's just, I can make this sound. This is amazing. And you think, because initially, for the first few years, or 10 years, however long, that you work as an artist, you think, because I made this must be good. And that way of relating to your work continues for quite a long time. And when you finally turn the corner from that, this is when you go from, when you leave that idea behind and you realize, well, whether I made it or not, that has no relevance to whether it's good. That has nothing to do with it. And when you finally turn that corner, that is when you go from being an apprentice to being a practitioner. It's when you become a working artist, basically. When my first book was published, which is the third book I wrote, but the first published book, American Rust, I was pretty fully formed as an artist. By then, I was in my early, mid-30s. I've been working for 14 years, writing for 14 years. I knew who I was artistically. And my biggest worry at that point was not whether or not I was good. It was making sure that no one else affected my voice. It was keeping the voices of critics out, the voices of teachers out, the voices of other writers out. So what I was most interested in is protecting myself. Which in the end was quite lucky, because a lot of my friends now, who are young famous writers you've heard of, they're dealing with having success at a younger age, And they're coming of age in the spotlight artistically. They're coming of age as artists with everyone paying attention to what they're doing. For me, by the time I had any public exposure, I was already done. I was made. I was, this is my voice, this is who I am. I don't care what anyone else says. I mean, really, I didn't care. It could be the most powerful editor on earth, and I didn't care. So that was crucial, and that, in the end, was easier, even though it required 15 years of failing to get to that point. I think it's you're very lucky if you discover your voice in private, basically, because discovering in public is a bit of a curse, I think. Yeah, so American Rust was, on some level, it was the story of these kids I'd grown up with. So it was the story of these guys. I grew up in a working class neighborhood. My parents, we were sort of struggling. Middle class people, we had no money because my mother was an artist. My father was sort of perpetual graduate student. So we were always poor. We were on government assistance. Even though both my parents had been to university, they're both intellectuals, basically. So we were kind of a typical bohemian intellectual family living in this kind of rundown neighborhood. And it was quite noticeable to me going in that all of the guys, kids I grew up with, their fathers and grandfathers had these good jobs in industry, heavy industry, steel mills, shipyards, auto plants, blah, blah, blah. And those jobs have been lost. So those jobs were gone. They'd gone overseas, they'd gone away entirely. And on some level, I guess, the story I was always getting at least the first 15 years I was a writer, is the story of these guys. That wasn't quite my childhood, but it was sort of the childhood of all my neighbors, which is what happens when you grow up with no hope. What happens when your father had a very stable life and a stable job, and his father back 150 years, and all of a sudden, for you, there's no structure, there's no hope. Because in the end, I mean, unless you can feed yourself, it doesn't. That's all that matters. You have to be able to eat. Everything else, comes later. Democracy, philosophy, art. You have to eat first and foremost. So, American Rust was about these two young guys who were growing up in an era similar to the one I grew up in. They're, in a steel mill town, and my neighborhood was a textile mill neighborhood. But it was a sort of one industry place. And it's what happens when the place you're in stops being a place that you can survive, and you have to leave. For me, I write the book that I do not understand how to write. So American Rust, stylistically, it actually is probably a little more ambitious than The Sun, because the material would hold that. Formally, structurally, in terms of the size of the story and the size of the ideas, of course, The Sun is much more ambitious. So with American Rust, I did not know how to write in this third-person stream of consciousness style. And I thought, okay, I will write a book in that style because I did not know how to do it. And so I learned the style, and I became good at it, and I wrote American Rust. For The Sun, it was, again, this thing I didn't understand. I did not know how you would write a book that took place over 50 years or 75 years or 100 years. American Rust took place over 2 weeks. So I thought, okay, this I do not understand, and I knew I wanted to write about this greater American idea, like the idea of sort of what did the American dream come from, or what's the American creation mythology, what's the origin of this. And again, I did not know how to write that story. So, and I didn't know how to even formally or structurally approach it. So that's what called me to it. I mean, because in the end, you're spending, American Rust was 3.5 years, The Sun was 5 years. So it's 5 years of your life, right? And you have so much time on Earth, and you're gonna spend 5 years doing this one thing. It better be something that doesn't bore you. So if you go in and you write, there's a saying in America, maybe here too, you write what you know. And in a narrow way, this is true. You write, if you're describing a scene or a human, you have to actually understand it before you can get it down accurately. But I think more broadly, you have to write about what you don't know or don't understand, because you have to you have to wake up every morning and decide you're going to do this thing which no one may care about, no one may read but you and your girlfriend or boyfriend or wife or husband or whatever, and your parents. And you have to keep doing this no matter what. So in the end, the person you have to be pleasing is you. You're the person who has to be happy at the end of every day. Otherwise, there's no point. So I think, for me anyway, the thing I'm writing is always the thing that I don't quite understand. By the end, of course, I do. But at the beginning, it's something it's a compelling idea, but it's not one that I really have a strong grasp on. It depends. So in the first book, what I was aiming at was still, frankly, a fairly big idea, which is what happened to the blue-collar middle class in America, because there is no blue-collar middle class left. A class of people who live a good life, they're right in the middle of society, but they make things with their hands. Those people have basically disappeared from the sort of social structure, or they're now all in the bottom. Whereas for most of the 20th century, those people they made the basis of the sort of people in the middle of our society in the US. So the first book was that. What happened to these people, and what is the cost to society of losing these people, or having them fall to the bottom? The second book was, I guess in some way, the first book was also about how has the American dream stopped working? And how has it gone so wrong for this large group of people? The second book was about the kind of the origins of the American dream, or the origins of the American mythology, the idea of what all Americans grow up with a sense of, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what your last name is, doesn't matter what you come from, you can be anything. You can be anyone you want, which of course, this is not true. We know this is not true. But it is what informs our society on every single level. And everyone actually believes it on some level, which is occasionally bad. But I guess what I wondered was, why do we believe this? Europeans don't believe this, right? I mean, why do we believe this? What is the origin of this mythology? And that was what drew me into the Sun and writing this book. You read all the greats, to a certain extent, maybe because it's your job, but mostly because you want to learn from these people, right? So you read Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Hemingway, everyone who seems relevant. Any book that someone tells you, someone you trust tells you, oh, this book's good, you go, I have 5,000 books, 6,000 books, I don't even know. I have so many books because any book that has the potential to teach me something about anything, I will get it right away. So, yeah, of course, you read the sort of those great, the sort of historically accepted great American novels. Of course you read them, you have to. Am I in dialogue with them? I don't know. I don't think about it that way. What I think about is, I have this to say, and I've chosen this style and sort of way of telling the story, and the style and your structure and the people you pick to populate your story, that is what, that's those things sort of control your meaning. So if you choose a style like Joyce or a style like Faulkner, there's certain things you can say very, very well, and there are other things that you can't say at all. And if you choose a style like Fitzgerald, there are certain things, again, you can say very, very well, and other things you can't really do so much. And so as you work, you're looking for some, you find the voice and the style you want to, that fits the philosophy or the ideas you're trying to communicate. So, I guess I don't think of myself as being in dialogue with those people, really. I think of myself as just trying to tell the truest version of sort of like what it is to be human, that I can, basically. So yeah, so Blood Reading was a book that I worshipped for a long time. Most young writers or up and coming writers in the U.S., if they're stylists, or if they see themselves as being stylistic writers, you worship Cormac McCarthy and Blood Meridian. But I think my interest was always in communicating, is always in communicating the emotional truth or the emotional reality of a moment or a scene or a time to the reader. So I don't need for things to be graphic necessarily at all. But if showing the reality of a scene requires being graphic, you're graphic. To be honest, a lot of the violence in the Sun I toned down from the original drafts because I realized, and I think this is what happens in Cormac McCarthy, the violence becomes so sort of stylized that you're numb to it. And and it's the same thing that happens in Quentin Tarantino movies and war movies. So many deaths appear on screen. A body falls up and falls. A guy's here, and then he falls over. Another guy falls over, and it has no meaning to you. These deaths have no meaning. And I wanted every death in the book to have a meaning. Because the problem with all of our histories, is that you think all histories are basically the histories of war. Every country's history is the history of war. These are the people we conquered. These are the lands we took. And then now, okay, maybe now we live here and we've lost some of those lands. But obviously you dehumanize the people that you kill, and you dehumanize the people your country kills. And this is something I did not want to do. I wanted absolutely every death to feel like a loss. Sometimes that requires being more graphic than, someone else might be. Other times it requires being less graphic, because sometimes that sort of like beautiful description, in quotes, and the sort of intense description of something quite bloody, it actually numbs you so much that you forget that this thing you're talking about is the death of a human. So, yeah, I hope, frankly, I admire Cormac McCarthy a lot, but I hope that what he and I are doing are different, because I think that in his books, you don't experience death as loss that much. You experience it as, a beautifully portrayed death, but not necessarily as the loss of a human being. Whatever great writer you're compared to is wonderful. But I think right now this is still quite easy. I can see it becoming harder, but because I spent the first 15 years of my life artistically working in a vacuum. No one cared what I did. No one knew who I was. I knew I had the potential to be good, and no one else seemed to. So in order to make it at all, I had to ignore everyone else's opinion about my work. That's quite an easy habit to maintain. So now when someone says something, you're like Cormac McCarthy or Faulkner or some other writer who you admire and grew up admiring, it comes into my head and I push it out as quickly as possible, because that kind of praise is just as damaging as criticism. Artistically, to your ego, it's great, but artistically, it's absolutely as damaging as someone saying you're horrible, because in the end, it actually comes from inside you. The thing that makes all art good, at least this sort of non-collaborative arts, is a single person's voice. It's not a committee. It's one person's voice. It's one human's voice. And when you're worried about what other people think, you're done. You're completely screwed. You'll never make anything good. So I would say if I have a worry about my future, it's that, maybe enough time passes, I forget to forget what everyone else is saying about me. I forget to ignore what other people are saying about the work, and I start to believe, the hype about my work. If that happens, that'll be very, very bad. So that is the worry I have. If I have an anxiety, it's that I begin to believe the sort of the bullshit about my stuff, because you have to trust only yourself. Yeah, I certainly growing up, there are two sides of me. One is the sort of like son of these intellectuals, lots of books, lots of political talk and intellectual talk around the dinner table. Outside, it's a very poor neighborhood. People were suffering. It's quite violent. So I got into fights all the time. I was jumped all the time. I was jumped and beaten up constantly. But so there's sort of a split life. Inside, I was sort of this one, let's say the sensitive artistic kid. And outside, you could not be that person or you'd be eaten alive. So outside, I was sort of faked, this tough exterior, which I never liked or never really believed in some way. And that, I think at some point, those two sides of me continue to exist. There's a side of me that's quite intellectual, or, whatever. That means all I think about is ideas and books and art. And there's another side of me that, I have to have these animal level experiences. I go hunting by myself for a week or two, go deep into the woods alone, don't see anyone else, hunt animals, kill them, skin them, eat them. There's a part of me, it's not like I need adrenaline, but I need intense experiences. And it's just, it's an animal level compulsion to have those things. So I don't know if art is how I process those things. I don't think it is. I think I still just need to have those intense physical experiences and sort of be in touch with my body and being physical and having some risk or danger in my life. But it feels a bit, not compartmentalize, but when I sort of do those things, okay, now I'm out in the woods alone and my internal monologue shuts off and I think only of hunting this animal for, again, a week or two depending. And I have really no thoughts at all except food, water, shelter, stay warm, stay out of the snow. And then where is the animal going? And then when I'm home, I don't think about that stuff at all. I mean, it really is like comes back to writing books and thinking about art and reading other people's work, and yeah. So no, writing again. Really, it's your question is quite reasonable. I think for me, it's not a way to process anything. It is really there's something inside me that's an artist, and I don't know why, and I have to listen to it. So I just and because my form is the novel or fiction, that's what I have to do. But it doesn't feel like I'm processing anything. It feels like if I didn't do that, I would destroy myself, So it's like an animal thing that has to be let out. And the only way to let it out is by making art somehow.